Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. This is our third public meeting for the Hutchinson River Watershed Plan. This is the first phase of this planning effort that focuses on Westchester County. And if you haven't seen already, our plan is out for public comment. During today's meeting, we're going to walk through the main components of the plan, hear from you, your initial thoughts, and then encourage you to take a deeper dive on your own time and send us your comments by the 16th of February. Next slide. So we'll start with some introductions. We'll go over what we mean by watershed and watershed planning, and we will talk through the existing conditions of the Hutchinson River watershed. We'll go through our watershed goals that we developed with the community. Biohabitats, our consultant, will walk through all the different recommendation types that have come out of this planning process for different projects. And then we will wrap up by walking through the implementation and monitoring portions of the plan and tell you about our next steps. Next slide. So for those of you who haven't heard of Save the Sound before, we are a regional environmental nonprofit. We focus on the Long Island Sound, so both within New York State and Connecticut. And our teams work to fight climate change, save endangered lands, protect the Long Island Sound and all the rivers that flow to it, including the Hutchinson River. And our team in particular, we really love to work with nature to restore ecosystems in our region. Next slide, thanks. So this watershed planning process is being led by Save the Sound with Westchester County and Soil and Water Conservation District as a key partner. We are funded through the Long Island Sound Study Futures Fund, which has EPA funding administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And we're really lucky to have contracted Biohabitats, our consultant, who has done some really great work on this plan. So I will do some quick introductions. I myself am Katie Friedman. I'm the New York Ecological Restoration Program Manager. I'll pass it over to Nicole Davis.
Hey, good evening. My name is Nicole Davis. I'm the Watersheds Project Manager with Save the Sound, and I've been working with Katie and Megan on this, and I'll pass it over to Megan.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Megan Lung. I'm the New York Ecological Restoration Project Manager working with Katie and Nicole. And I will be taking care of our notes and keeping an eye on the chat for us tonight. And I'll pass it over to Rebecca.
Hi, good evening. My name is Rebecca Weiner-Skinnabt. I'm a Senior Project Manager with Biohabitats. And Biohabitats is a firm that practices ecological restoration throughout the country.
Thanks, Rebecca. And Nicole Leibel.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Leibel. I'm Principal Environmental Planner with Westchester County Planning Department and also District Manager of the Westchester County Soil and Water Conservation District. This is one of our watershed management plans. We're also working on a few others in the Long Island Sound, so happy to hear from everyone. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, everyone. Excellent. And for those of you on the call tonight, if you could please enter in the chat your name and your affiliation. You can also enter in one of your favorite animals that you can find within the watershed or in the river. We'd love to hear from you. You may have noticed already that this meeting is being recorded, so we will be able to publish this recording for anyone who may have missed it. We also ask if you have any questions throughout this meeting that you put them in the chat, and then we will have time for some more interactive feedback using Mentimeter, which we'll walk you through when we get to those sections. Thanks. Next slide. All right, and I'll hand it over to Nicole Davis.
Thanks, Katie. And I'm going to kick off my favorite animal in the watershed because I think that's a great idea. And I'm going to go with the blue crab. We found a couple actually when we were on a stream walk earlier this summer. And it was really exciting to see them up in Mount Vernon. So the fact that they're up in the watershed too is always an exciting thing. And I just want to start with some level setting tonight. I appreciate everyone's time. I guess the most important thing about this project is we're developing a watershed plan for the Hutchinson River, but making sure that everybody knows what a watershed actually is and why we're focusing on the scale. A watershed is essentially any area of land that collects water or sends water to a body of water. So that was not a very eloquent statement. But so rivers, streams, puddles, right? When rainwater hits the ground, they all hit the ground and go somewhere. They try to get to the lowest point. And what I think is fantastic about looking at things at a watershed scale is that it's kind of devoid of political boundaries. So it doesn't matter what community you live in, what neighborhood you live in, what town you live in, or even what county you look at. Water is kind of that great unifier. So it carries things from the top of the watershed, the headwaters, all the way down to the bottom. So what's happening in the headwaters impacts what's happening in the mouth of the river and vice versa. So it's important to think about that context of how we're connected, not just these little bubbles that we tend to live in and think about. And so for the past year and a half, I think is what we're at now, we have been working on a watershed plan for the Hutchinson River, which the Hutchinson River itself is a relatively small watershed. The river itself is only about 9 miles long and it's very narrow. And I'm sure, as all of you know, it's also very densely developed. The watershed, or the river itself, throws through 6 municipalities, starting in Westchester County and then going through the Bronx before it enters Eastchester Bay and Long Island Sound. And so it's just really important to think about, what happens in Scarsdale affects what happens in the Bronx. And so keeping that connectivity in mind as we're working throughout the watershed and as we're thinking about the river and as we're talking about this plan, it's really that connectivity throughout this watershed that drives us home. So when we started out on this adventure, we knew a few things about the Hutchinson River. We knew that it was a small watershed, and we knew that it had impairments identified by the State Department, or the New York DEC. And I'm just going back to this last slide for one quick second. This map shows the Hutchinson River and the watershed itself, but what's important to recognize is these areas in red. These are areas with identified impairments that have been identified by the state through water quality monitoring and testing. And so almost the entire watershed has some sort of impairment, which means water quality is not meeting the standards that they expect it to for its classified uses. So that means that it's not suitable for recreation or boating or swimming. And so that's just really important to think about, that this entire watershed is impaired with the exception of a few small areas. And it's not that they're not impaired, they just haven't been assessed yet. And so that's what really kind of drove the Hutchinson River into the forefront of our planning efforts. And so the idea was that we would put together a cohesive framework, bringing together all the partners who were interested in the Hutchinson River. Some are interested in it for an environmental perspective, others are interested in it for boating, others are municipalities who have to care about the watershed because there's certain regulations that push them that way. Others are people that live by the river or people who just want to be able to enjoy the river. And so having these conversations is really kind of what drove this entire process. And the idea was that we all want to improve and see a clean Hutchinson River. And that by putting together a full-scale plan, it gives us the opportunity to talk about what's important to people and how we can kind of all march in the same direction to fix the river and work together, thinking about the headwaters, the middle of the river, and the bottom of the river. And that although as a birder, I may not care about what's happening with stormwater, I do recognize that stormwater is important to cleaning up the river. And so keeping those conversations and dialogues open. And the idea is that we would have a cohesive plan that would set a framework forward to start improving it. And the ultimate goal of this project was to delist ultimately the Hutchinson River, meaning that we would reduce all the impairments. And that's a big long-term effort. That's not something that's going to happen in 6 months or 10 years. It's something that's going to take a lot of time with a lot of people working together to do that. And so this is kind of that first step in thinking about how we can meet that end goal. The other thing that I think is important about this watershed planning process is that it was community driven. And so we followed what's called the EPA 9-element process, which was a framework that was developed a number of years ago to kind of start looking at impairments and watersheds and kind of put together this step-by-step process to put together a watershed plan that would be useful for a community. And what we really wanted was a plan that would be useful for anyone to pick up, whether you're a nonprofit organization that focuses on planting trees, or you're a municipal sewer entity, that you could still take this plan and have a framework and say, I know what they're talking about and I know why we're doing this. And the idea was that we didn't want a plan that was going to be written and then sit on a shelf, because that would have just been a waste of all of our time. It doesn't matter how cohesive the plan was or how many great ideas were in it. If no one's interested in taking this plan and moving it to the next level, it doesn't really matter. We're not going to do anything to improve water quality. And so that's why we really focused on stakeholder engagement. We were really lucky to have a steering committee with 43 members that showed up regularly and commented. We also brought the plan to the public on 3 separate occasions before this to kind of really start this conversation about what's important in the watershed and what people want to see happen. And then we took the opportunity to get people out into the river. This picture is actually where we found the blue crab, but really getting people to think about the river from the inside out, not looking into it as a human being. And so that was kind of the stepping stones and how we started this process. And just to acknowledge all the people who were on the steering committee who really spent time. We met every other month for the last year and a half. They reviewed some pretty hefty technical memos that were put together by Biohabitats, and they reviewed the first few drafts of the watershed-based plan, and they really spent a lot of time thinking about how the plan was useful for them and provided some really amazing feedback to make it a better document for everybody. So I'm not going to list the long name. You know who you are, and we really do appreciate the efforts that went into this. And I'm going to pass it back to Katie to talk about the existing conditions. And so this is what we know the watershed looked like starting out.
Thanks, Nicole. And just to reiterate too, so our draft plan is available for public comment. It's on our website. We'll pop a link in the chat and share a link at the end of the presentation as well. So the point of this public meeting is to orient you to the plan, give you some high-level summaries, and then we'd love for you to be able to take some time and really read the full draft plan and provide comments to us in detail by February 16th. But to set the stage, we started off by doing a baseline assessment to better understand what are the existing conditions of the Hutchinson River and its watershed, the land draining to the river. Next slide. So this baseline assessment, conducted largely by Biohabitats, involved gathering information, doing a desktop analysis, going around, driving and walking throughout the watershed by doing a windshield summary, so identifying interest, doing a technical pollution load model, so better understanding where our hotspots are for pollution loading within the watershed, and then comparing sub-drainage areas in order to help us target locations for restoration potential. Next slide. So the Hutchinson River has a watershed in Westchester County that's about 8 square miles. The river is 9.5 miles long, flowing up from Scarsdale all the way down through the Bronx into Eastchester Bay. There's 8 different jurisdictions within the watershed. It's a Class B water quality water body. There's 4 dams on the river, and as we'll see in the next few slides, there are a lot of transportation routes crossing the Hutch, several environmental areas that have been deemed critical by the state, and national historic resources as well. Next slide. So land use is a big component of this planning process. The type of land use that you encounter really impacts the types of pollutants and the quantity of pollutants that flow off of our land when it rains and into a receiving water body like the Hutchinson River. So in this slide, you can see in purple, the vast majority of the watershed land is residential land use. You can see in orange, there's pockets of industrial land use. And particularly in that industrial, commercial, and residential land use areas, that's where we see a lot of hard impervious surfaces. That's our hard paved roadways, our sidewalks, our buildings. And so when that rainfall comes down, instead of infiltrating into the ground or into, say, a forested area, that rain is going to instead pool up and run off, carrying whatever pollutants it encounters along the way into the Hutchinson River. And so when we think about pollution sources, particularly non-point source pollution sources, we really need to better understand the land use and the impervious cover in the watershed to identify the main culprits. Next slide. Thanks so much. So many people know of the Hutchinson River Parkway and tend to forget about the Hutchinson River itself. This water body is bordered by the Hutchinson River Parkway for the vast extent of its reach. There's also other critical transportation routes that you can see in this map here. And so we wanted to highlight how the river has been impacted by our need to get from point A to point B over the years. Next slide. In terms of ecology, you can see in this map here, we've mapped different types of wetland resources. These range from our lakes and ponds, several of which along the river are artificially made through dams. And then we have freshwater wetland areas and the river itself. And as you can see in this image, we really don't have long stretches of continuous natural habitat. This is a really fragmented, developed watershed. That being said, there are critical environmental areas as defined by New York State that are that much more critical because of their because of the lack of open space and natural areas in this watershed. So those are Twin Lakes County Parks, Nature Study Woods, Wilson Woods Parks, for example. We do have endangered species within the watershed. I saw in the chat someone put in piping plover as their favorite animal. Monarch butterfly are found in the watershed as well. And I mentioned dams before, but these are found within the river. I believe there's 4 dams, and they do impact the ability for migratory fish to reach their spawning grounds. So there is a lack of aquatic connectivity as well. Next slide, please. Flooding is a really big issue along the Hutchinson River. This plan took into account FEMA flood maps and also looked at many other hazard mitigation plans and reports of flooding in order to better understand where there could be projects that could both improve water quality but also try to help mitigate localized flooding. Next slide. Water quality of Hutchinson River, Nicole touched on this, but the Hutchinson River is listed on the New York State 303D list of impaired water bodies, and the pollutants of concern are oil and grease, low dissolved oxygen, which aquatic organisms rely on to survive and thrive, and fecal coliform bacteria. So the map that we are showing here is found in the report. This is showing oil and grease hotspots, and this was done by our consultants by looking for dense areas of auto body shops, gas stations, essentially land use and development and companies that would be more likely to experience oil and grease leaks or dumping. And so by doing this approach, we're able to see where we can pinpoint specific hotspot locations for pollution mitigation and reduction. Next slide, please. So the watershed is quite big, over 8 square miles, and to be able to more manageably address these issues, we broke out the watershed into sub-drainage areas. So these were delineated based on topography and the existing stormwater infrastructure. And so within each of these drainage areas, water eventually flows to the Hutchinson River. And we were able to identify 12 of those sub-watersheds. Thanks, Nicole. Next slide. So biohabitats will talk a bit more about their watershed treatment model and pollution load estimates later on. But essentially, they were able to take in precipitation data, land use data. So again, whether that's residential land, commercial land, industrial land, and then the percent of that hard impervious cover, and use those data in the watershed treatment model to estimate annual pollutant loads for each of those sub-watersheds. And for the pollutants of concern, we're talking here about total suspended solids, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and bacteria. Next slide. The outcome of that model, here's a couple of examples, shows the estimated annual pollution loads per year per sub-watershed. And so the gradated colors here show darker means higher nitrogen loading per pound per acre per year, and lighter colors are less pollutant loading. So we can see this was done for nitrogen, also for bacteria, for fecal coliform, and also for total suspended solids and total phosphorus as well. And again, there's more detail on this later on in this presentation, but also a technical memo as an appendix of the plan itself. So if you're really interested in the modeling component, we have a lot of data to share with you. Next slide, please. So those are our existing conditions, a quick overview. There's a lot more detail in the plan itself. We were able to work with our first public meeting participants and think through, all right, here's our watershed, here's how it lies today. What are some of the goals? What do we want to see as an outcome of the projects that are developed through this planning process? And so we were able to come up with 4 goals. We used an interactive Jamboard, which you can see an image of here, where we asked a few targeted questions. And folks were really interested in seeing, of course, improved water quality, but also improved habitat and local ecosystems. So looking at projects that not only improve the quality of the water, but also expand habitat. There's also a severe lack of access to the Hutchinson River, and so being able to both access the river and provide educational opportunities was really important to the local community. And so that's how we landed on these 4 watershed goals that really have guided the development of this watershed plan. Next slide, please. Great. And with that, I will hand it over to Rebecca to walk through some of the recommendations that came out of this planning process.
So the recommendations were largely split into 2 types. There's recommendations that can apply across the majority of the watershed, and then or maybe a specific set of subwatersheds. And then there's ones that are very site specific, like do a tree planting right here. So we're going to talk about those 2 types of recommendations, starting with the watershed-wide recommendations first. So the watershed-wide recommendations, the first kind are kind of more programmatic or operational changes, or maybe introducing a new program. And so the first one is establishing a lead entity. And so there have been ongoing conversations, and of course there's a steering committee, Save the Sound, and Westchester County have all been involved. But the idea is identifying a lead that would be able to, continue to carry forward these recommendations, identify funding sources, developing annual plans, leading public outreach activities, and so on and so forth. And so those conversations continue to work to identify those responsibilities. The previous slide. The next one is improving stream and river accessibility. And so as many of you may be familiar with, there's a high level of development along the river. And so access to the river is very limited. And so this recommendation is about improving that access, particularly for communities that have been historically separated from the river. And in particular, we're recommending certain areas on publicly owned land to improve that access, both from maybe a trail standpoint, and then also for paddlecraft as well. Barrier removal and aquatic organism passage. So this is about improving passage for migratory species like the alewife, and building on the success that we've seen in other projects within the watershed. Community involvement. So we want to, provide more meaningful ways for the public to engage in the watershed planning and improving water quality. So things like, a smartphone app where citizens could report watershed issues, such as maybe if you see dumping or excessive sediment from a construction site, those types of things. One aspect that we weren't able to do maybe as quite in depth as we would have liked is engage the schools. So that's definitely a future recommendation, is to work with them more. Establish more robust water quality monitoring. There is very limited water quality data in the watershed. And so improving that is just going to help inform, where we can really have the most bang for the buck in terms of improving water quality. And then golf course, lawn, and pet waste outreach. And so all of those, of course, are working in partnership with folks to improve both, fertilizer application and pesticide application practices, and then also picking up after pets to reduce bacterial loading. Now, next slide. And then these are more specific, water quality improvement projects, but across maybe several watersheds. So the first one is retrofitting public land. And what that means is to provide water quality treatment where none exists. So maybe a very large parking lot where the runoff is allowed to just run off untreated into a nearby tributary to the Hutchinson River. Instead, we would, construct some sort of intervention to collect and capture that stormwater runoff and filter it before it goes into the stream or river. Increased tree canopy coverage. There are many, many, many benefits of trees. And so we're looking for opportunities to increase tree canopy. There's stormwater runoff benefits, there's heat island reduction benefits, and the list goes on. So we're looking to do that as well, again, on public land. Increased street sweeping. So municipalities currently do, I believe, around, I think it might vary the frequency, but we assumed monthly street sweeping within the municipalities. And so, we're recommending that be increased, particularly in some of the industrial areas. And there's a huge pollutant load reduction benefit to increasing street sweeping. Dumpster replacement and outreach. So we did see some, during our field assessments, some dumpsters in pretty poor condition. And so that allows trash to, if there's not a good lid, a good secure lid, trash can be blown out and eventually end up in our streams and rivers, or also just that allows the rainfall to filter down through that dumpster and create a very nice kind of dumpster stew, if you will, that will run off into streams and rivers as well. So just looking to improve the quality of those dumpsters. Oil and grit separators for industrial sites. An oil and grit separator is another intervention. It's 2 chambers. The first chamber removes large solids like trash, and then the second chamber removes oil. So they're good for those industrial sites. They're underground and pretty compact. And then greening vacant lots. We noticed a fair number of vacant lots in some of the subwatersheds, and so that's just an opportunity to improve both aesthetics. There's a community benefit, and then also there's a water quality benefit as well. Next slide.
And so now we're going to try something that we've never used in a public presentation before. So I'm just saying that, so bear with us. Hopefully this will work. Oh, I'm sorry, my slide didn't change. There we go. We're going to try using a Mentimeter, which is similar to a Jamboard. It's an online platform that allows us to kind of collect information and kind of all comment at the same time. So what you can do is either use your smartphone. Oh, there we go. Use your smartphone to I'm gonna erase that line. To scan the code, the QR code on the screen, or you can just go to menti.com and enter the code on the screen, 75155600, and we'll pop that in the chat too, just so people can just click on the link to get to the Mentimeter if the QR code is not working. And what you're gonna see is a word cloud. Really, we're looking for information. What types of resources do you think your community would benefit from to start implementing projects? We've got a really great suite of projects that we've identified and we've talked to people about, but now we're trying to move into the next step. We've got a solid plan, and although we're still looking for feedback and information, we're also starting to look forward and implementation. And what do you think would be helpful for your community to start moving the plan forward, to implement projects, to reach out to community members, just things that you are thinking that could be useful for you. And I'm going to pull that up. Hopefully you can all see the Mentimeter now. And again, the code is right here on the top. Educational information is the first thing that popped up, which is great. And if you have any thoughts too on the type of educational information, are they handouts that you can give to elected officials that really drive home, what's important in the river, information that can be shared with teachers or students, or is it, kind of bigger or more targeted things like something that we can send to golf courses to talk about proper land use management, or that we can send out to homeowners thinking about pet waste and why it's important to clean up after them, or why it's important to not drop your nips down a storm drain. Which I only say because these are all things that we have seen. Or if for whatever reason the Mentimeter is not working for you, also feel free to drop your ideas in the chat. And list of funding opportunities. That makes me happy because we have that for you, which we'll get to in a few more slides. So we did start to compile a list of potential funding opportunities, and trying to think about a way that, the state maintains a website of when they're open. I believe the county has some of that information as well. Volunteer opportunities. Don't be shy, there are no bad answers here. And we'll think about this for one more minute before we move on. And don't worry if you don't have a good word or idea that you want. We have a couple more opportunities throughout this presentation for you to give us ideas. I appreciate money. And just for whoever popped property ownership information, just thinking about that further, would you be thinking about information that can be shared with property owners, or kind of knowing who owns like a vacant property or who owns a property where potential opportunities could happen, or if it's public versus private?
It's knowing who owns the property.
Thanks, Jane. Great, this is a fantastic start, and the Mentimeter will be active for the entirety of the presentation. So if you have more ideas that pop into your head, please feel free to jump back to this, and we will come back to it in just a moment. But we are going to go back to the presentation now, if everyone is ready.
All right, back into the recommendations. So we went through the watershed-wide recommendations, and now we're going to drill down and get a little bit more specific and look at the opportunities that we identified through our field assessments. So we concentrated our field assessments mostly in 4 of the 12 subwatersheds, and that's because they generally represented different types or characteristics of subwatersheds that we were seeing throughout the Hutchinson River watershed. So they were kind of representative of other areas. And so their recommendations may translate very well to other subwatersheds. So we have Reservoir 3 located kind of towards the north here, Pelham Lake, and then also Sprague Terminal and Vernon Park located down in the south, southern portion of the watersheds. And so, we've got subwatersheds that have larger-ish, relatively speaking, water bodies. They have a pretty good opportunity for restoration, meaning there's land or a fair amount of public land or institutional landowners. And then Sprague Terminal and Vernon Park, just represent a different type of subwatershed. They're more densely developed. There's more industrial area, so just different considerations. And we did conduct our assessments on or from publicly accessible spaces. So maybe like a shopping center parking lot, or, if we were, or potentially like a right-of-way or a street. We did not, go onto private property to do these assessments. Next slide. So we were looking for opportunities that primarily are going to improve water quality, especially our pollutants of concern, or enhance habitat. And so the 3 types of assessments, and I'm going to talk about them in more detail in a second here. Hotspot, stormwater retrofits, and reforestation. And that was based on kind of the characteristics of the watershed and what we thought were the kind of the best opportunities to improve water quality or enhance habitat. So first is the hotspot assessment. So first you might be wondering, what is a hotspot? Generally, hotspot is just very generically like a land use that might be contributing larger than normal or average pollutant loading from the site based on its activity or land use type. And so, yeah, we just targeted locations that might have the potential to contribute large amounts of stormwater pollution. So types of businesses assessed included auto body shops, shopping centers, scrap metal, stockpiling, asphalt production. And then common recommendations from this assessment were street sweeping, because that picks up, debris from the street, dumpster replacement, of course, lots of education and outreach, hopefully forming partnerships with these businesses to improve practices on site. Bulk material management, and what we mean by that is, there's industries that have very large piles of materials, like raw materials stored outside, and just working to reduce exposure to stormwater runoff, or just preventing that material from running off the site to begin with. Pavement replacement or repairs, we saw a fair amount of deteriorating pavement, and then of course the oil grit separator, which I talked about earlier. The next one was stormwater retrofit assessment. And so this is providing water quality treatment for impervious surfaces that currently do not have any. And so we were really looking at large swaths of impervious cover. So like a large parking lot, for example. So we primarily assessed large parking lots, schools from the right of way, playgrounds, institutional land. And I'll go over what these stormwater retrofits are, but the types of retrofits we recommended are bioretention, regenerative stormwater conveyance, and stormwater wetlands. So you can see here on the left-hand side of the slide, we've got some pictures of what a regenerative stormwater conveyance looks like. This might be, if you know stormwater a little bit, this one might be the least familiar to you. It's a relatively speaking, newer practice. And basically what it is, it's a series of step pulls, usually at an outfall, to step down the runoff down to a tributary or stream. And so what it's doing is it's just slowing down and filtering that runoff as it makes its way down to the stream, instead of creating a very large eroded gully, going to that stream instead. So you're providing both conveyance and treatment. The next one on the right-hand side is a bioretention area. And this basically is, you create a hole in the ground, for lack of a better way of saying it, depressed area in the ground, depression, and you fill it with an engineered soil media, and then plants on top. And what that does is it allows the stormwater runoff to come in, it ponds up within the facility, and then slowly filters down through the soil. And both the soil media and the plant uptake work together to reduce pollutants and remove pollutants from that stormwater runoff. And they can be planted kind of in a very aesthetically pleasing manner, and they can also be planted to be, more of a pollinator type of habitat as well. So next, the third assessment is a reforestation assessment. And we targeted areas with the potential to increase tree canopy. So like as shown in this picture here, we have kind of just some unused lawn. And so this is an opportunity where it would make a lot of sense to, just do a tree planting here. And so that's what we were looking for. And we were looking for areas where we could make a big impact by planting either a lot of trees or planting trees that have overhang over, once they grow up, have overhang over impervious surfaces. So they're providing stormwater interception and of course, reducing that heat island. We also looked at, we definitely noted where we saw non-native and invasive species and made some recommendations there as well. And so very generally, those recommendations included reforestation, conservation landscaping, or street tree planting. So after we got back from the field, we had a whole slew of recommendations, and it certainly helps to prioritize those recommendations, to kind of take a step back and say, which of these recommendations are the most beneficial from a water quality standpoint, and also feasible. So we use the same general framework to prioritize the recommendations that fell within those 3 assessments. And so we prioritize them, or scored them rather, based on environmental impact. So their ability to improve water quality, for example, or improve habitat. Our ability to actually address a problem. So this is the feasibility factor, like, what are the site constraints like? Are there a bunch of utilities that are going to be in the way? Things like that. And then also noting any sort of other ancillary benefits to the community, like, is this going to be implemented in a really highly visible area? And then also have the dual benefit of providing, kind of like an outreach and education benefit as well. We did vary those metrics slightly by the field assessment. So the metrics for hotspots are slightly different than the metrics for stormwater retrofits, but all fell within those 3 bins. And this is just an example to kind of illustrate how these sites got scored. So these are a few of our stormwater retrofit sites. So each one got that environmental score. Each one got an ability to address score, ancillary benefits, and then a total score, with 67 being the highest potential score. And I believe this might be our highest scoring site. So this one got a 61, and it's then therefore a high priority. And so, if we're looking at kind of staggering when these recommendations might be implemented and how we pursue funding and allocate funding, we would look to these high priority sites first, in combination with, of course, landowner willingness. So this is a map that just kind of showing the high priority sites. And so the red triangles are high priority hotspots. The yellow squares are high priority stormwater retrofits, and the green dots are high priority reforestation. And this is all available to you in the report, so you can kind of dig in and review things in much more detail. For the high priority reforestation and stormwater retrofit sites, we also produce the summary sheets. So the first page, is just kind of like a title page and locator page, essentially, with an aerial kind of showing the location of that site, helping you get a lay of the land and what's going on there. And then the second page has kind of some details that we identified both via desktop and from our field assessment. So it's like got the lat long, the type of stormwater retrofit, the ownership. So these are the types of factors we're thinking about when we're thinking about whether or not this is a feasible project or not. There's challenges for implementation, so utilities, property boundaries, things like that. And then you can kind of see just a high level scoring associated with that we used for the prioritization, along with some on-site photos. And the reforestation summary sheet follows the same format. We've got an aerial, the green blob that you see here on the left-hand side, that's our proposed planting area. And then kind of those factoids, if you will, that we collected in the field and desktop, lat long, what we're proposing there, the ownership, the land use. Is this visible? What kind of challenges might we encounter if we try to implement this project?
All right, and so now it's your turn again. We are going to try the Mentimeter. Again, there's a few more opportunities. And what we're talking about here is what project types really resonate with you. Rebecca really kind of talked through several different types of hotspots and bioretention opportunities and reforestation opportunities. And I guess what we're looking for from you is what type of project really makes you excited? Would you like to see happening in your community or in your favorite part in the watershed? Or if you have a favorite project, already read the plan or are familiar with some of the projects we've recommended, this is a great opportunity to kind of shout it out and bring some attention to the ones that you're interested in seeing move forward first. And this one's a little bit different than the last one that we had. It gives you an opportunity to kind of rank the projects in the order that you like, and you'll see kind of growth bars on the side as you move through this. And I apologize now too, I can't see the chat, so if there's any problems, if somebody can just look at that and see if anybody needs anything moving into this. And I'll just talk through for a minute the types of projects that we have ranking from, right now, it's just a matter of order, but we had reforestation, green infrastructure, aquatic connectivity, pollution hotspots, river access. It seems like things have become pretty static for the moment. So just looking at this, it looks like pollution hotspots are the things that are really kind of resonating with the folks on this call, followed by green infrastructure, river access, reforestation, and then aquatic connectivity. And just based on the conditions that we saw in the watershed, that's not surprising. It seems like, you know, there's a lot of opportunities throughout the watershed for these types of projects to move forward. So thank you. That kind of helps us think through what's important to you, and it's nice to hear. And again, if you want to add something in the chat about your favorite project, or if there's an area you'd really like to work, now's the time to start thinking about it. But you'll have that opportunity again momentarily. And I'll turn it back to Rebecca to talk about pollution loads.
Great. So I believe Katie touched on this a little bit back at the beginning of the presentation. So we did, there's more to this watershed plan than just water quality, but it certainly has a very heavy water quality emphasis because, you know, we want to improve the stream and the river. And then, of course, you know, the critters that live there and the people who would like to enjoy, you know, the river. So restoring its uses, its beneficial uses. So we utilize the watershed treatment model. It's a spreadsheet model, and it's largely land use based. So determining what the existing pollutant loads are in the watershed is based on the land use. And I've got a pie chart here just kind of showing you what the distribution of that land use is in the watershed. As you can see, it's largely residential, almost half residential. We've got some big wedges for roadway, commercial, and parks, it looks like, and a little bit of industrial and open water. So those are what's largely going to drive the pollutant loading as we've done it through the watershed treatment model. And the watershed treatment model is great for estimating sediment, that's TSS, total suspended solids, nutrients, so total phosphorus and total nitrogen, and then bacteria. And so there are two primary scenarios that we ran. So existing, looking at those land use loads, and then load reduction. So what happens if we assume that we're able to implement all those recommendations that I just went through, those watershed-wide and site-specific recommendations. So I'm just going to highlight nitrogen for the sake of brevity. Again, you can go to the watershed plan, you can read about all four of those pollutants that I mentioned earlier, total suspended solids, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and bacteria. I'm just highlighting total nitrogen. So in the existing pollutant loads, this is loading by land use. And so you see that residential, it's got a pretty big piece of the pie, but roadway is the biggest contributor, relatively speaking, in the watershed. We've got some industrial, we got some parks and some roadway and commercial contributing to those loads. So then in our second scenario, where we're applying all of those recommendations, So it included, select watershed-wide recommendations and all of the site-specific recommendations that we could come up with a pollutant load reduction for. So how much total nitrogen are we able to remove, and where are we seeing our greatest bang for the buck, if you will? And this big green wedge, quite large, big piece of the pie, is increasing street sweeping frequency to weekly. And that makes sense because we saw what a large contributor the roadways are to the pollutant loading. So if we're doing more sweeping and picking up more of that debris and all the pollutants associated with that debris, then that's going to have a big benefit. We see some benefit associated with increasing tree canopy over non-highway roads and school parking. We see a little bit from those stormwater retrofits, our site-specific stormwater retrofits. If we were to hypothetically retrofit 30% of public land, we'd get a nice wedge there. And just redevelopment over time as development turns over and more stormwater retrofits are put into place, that's going to have a benefit as well. And you can barely see it. There's a tiny, tiny line in here that is the site-specific reforestation. So while that doesn't have a huge water quality impact, as we've already discussed, trees just have so many other benefits as well. So we don't want to discount trees just because they're small, wedged there. But at least if we're looking at it from this standpoint, the trees aren't getting us a ton of bang for the buck just from a nitrogen standpoint. So we set some load reduction targets and just kind of to see how close we could get, applying all of these recommendations, how close do we get to these targets? So if we were to reduce 30% of total nitrogen, we would have to reduce nitrogen by about 17,000 pounds. So if we applied all of those recommendations, we would get about reductions in the order of about 7,000 pounds. So that would still leave us with about 10,000 pounds of removal to go. And similarly, it's a similar story for bacteria. It's like we get a good chunk of removal, but we still have a ways to go. And that actually brings up, it's a good segue to bring up a good point, which is that this is a living document, and this is just kind of the beginning. And I'm sure Katie or Nicole will be talking about this more too, right? But this is the start. We're gonna start doing these projects and hopefully gain momentum and be able to make more and more improvements over time and make more headway towards these targets and goals.
Thanks, Rebecca. And we're just going to take a few moments. There's a little bit more that we want to talk about in the plan, but to give you a chance to ask some questions, we just threw a whole lot of information at you. And I know a lot of what Rebecca talked about was pretty technical. So if there was anything that kind of popped up for you or questions that you have, why don't we take a few minutes?
And there have been some questions in the chat that Megan and I have been responding to. I can summarize those as folks think of any other questions they may have. But there are some questions about the existing dams, why they were built, and if there's a potential for removal. So many of the dams were built originally as drinking water sources, as reservoirs, but are no longer used for drinking water. And there has been some movement on a potential dam removal on the first dam and a feasibility study for a fish passage on the next upstream dam. We've also talked about flooding and how this plan may address some of the flooding issues in the watershed. We did reiterate that the goal of this plan is to improve water quality, but many of the projects that are recommended have co-benefits and are able to try to mitigate flooding by capturing and infiltrating stormwater runoff, or restoring riparian floodplain that can act as a sponge absorbing that stormwater. And let's see if there's any other questions rolling in.
Can I add a little bit more to that too?
Yes, yeah.
Is that some of the stormwater retrofits that we recommend are small, and so they're not going to improve like very large flooding events, but they can help to improve nuisance flooding that you might see, like ponding and things like that. And the way that we're also thinking about the design and choice of those stormwater interventions is we are thinking about ones that have, can handle a little bit more volume. So can we make that footprint a little larger than we normally would have, knowing that the intensification of our rainfall is increasing, with climate change. And then the other thing we think about too is making sure that those devices are designed so that they can overflow, because we know they can't handle a super large, like a hurricane sized event. So just making sure they're diverted and that runoff is getting, quickly, directed off site, to just ensure that we're not exacerbating the flooding condition on that particular site.
Thanks, Rebecca. There was also a comment about catch basins. So in the New Rochelle, Eastchester area, there's a catch basin with a large 30-inch storm drain that carries water from other properties, and there results in a large amount of debris, oil filters, car parts, liquid cement, plastic bags, dog poop that all get into the river. And so this plan does recommend more increased frequency of that street sweeping and catch basin clearing. But yeah, hearing that that's definitely an issue. So thank you for bringing that up, Nick.
Katie, if I can chime in really quickly on the flooding note, there is a flood study that the Resilient New York program with the firm SLR kicked off late last year. We've provided some information and data from this plan and from other efforts that are underway, both with Save the Sound and other partners. And just like a quick PSA about flooding. Flooding is this, natural phenomena that we call flooding when it specifically impacts humans. And there's a lot of complicated causes. A lot of causes that can compound flooding. So it's not just catch basins, it's not just dams, it's not just filling in of wetlands and impervious surfaces. It's all of those things compounding. So that's why, to Rebecca's point, really there are so many opportunities for implementation projects. Like each project can take off a little bit of an edge, and then cumulatively they can have a large impact.
Thanks, Megan.
And I feel like that is the perfect segue, if there's no other questions, kind of into the next section talking about implementation. And I kind of love that Megan alluded to this idea that small projects can have big impacts. Because I know, at least with the work that Save the Sound has done, kind of in other areas around the Sound, that's what we've really seen. It's these kind of clusters of small projects can really take out large amounts of stormwater. So each small practice does have its own benefits, even if they don't seem to be huge for the river itself. And just to keep that in mind as we're going forward. So within the plan, we have a series of implementation tables, both for site-specific and watershed-wide projects. And the idea of the tables is really to help prioritize how we implement the recommendations. I feel like over the course of a few weeks, Rebecca's team went out and assessed over 100 sites. Save the Sound joined them for some, and we did some supplemental recommendations. And so we talked about how we worked to prioritize those, recognizing that, first of all, not all the project sites that we visited were viable, which is important to recognize that, there's good places to do projects, and there's places that, although we want to do something, the conditions just don't necessarily line up right. But then even once we have all these projects, to hand somebody a list of 100 projects is really daunting. So how do we kind of parse them out? And so for this plan specifically, we took the projects that Rebecca's team kind of categorized as high priority, basically saying that these are the top 10 to 15 projects in each of the 3 categories that seem to have the most benefit based on the criteria she already talked about. And then we went and kind of broke those up again into smaller chunks, thinking about kind of short term, within the first 5 years, medium term, the next 5 to 7 years, and then longer term, 7 to 10 years. And those were broken up kind of based on low hanging fruit, Is there a project that's kind of dovetailed with something that's already planned in a community? You know, is there a group who really wants to champion this project and is already laying the groundwork for it to move forward? Or kind of what does this kind of design and permitting phase look like? You know, if there's still a lot of work before we can even get it to a point where we can get it to implementation, maybe that should be a longer term project. So we have time now to start the groundwork. And so we took those projects and kind of broke them up into this framework. And this is really just kind of a sample of a few of the projects and what the tables look like. We also kind of put in the information right away, kind of what the watershed plan goals that it addresses are. Most of them address more than one goal, and those kind of make it a stronger project because it's not just looking at water quality, or it's not just education and outreach focused. It's how do we overlap these things and really have the biggest impact within the watershed. We also took a stab at identifying who could be a potential lead organization. It's not a prescription, like none of this is prescriptive, and Rebecca's already talked about it being a living document. And so these are really just kind of guiding ideas to move this forward. And then we took a stab at the cost estimates. And so this is a plan. Right, we have not fully flushed out every single one of these projects. We've done the groundwork and looked at where some good potential opportunities are, but there's a little bit of additional work that needs to go into actually fully designing the project and thinking through the details. And so we use that information and our best judgment to kind of give you a rough price range. So as we're starting to think about the types of grants and how much funding we need to come up with. And there's a key for each table because that number shifts a little bit depending on the type of project that we're looking at. And then potential funding sources. We have a full list of potential funding sources that exist right now. It is not an exhaustive list, and it doesn't mean new programs aren't being created. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at this. But it kind of gives us a good starting point. And then we also kind of took this idea and started thinking about where do we want to go? So this is kind of a good starting point. The full plan has the plan itself has the initial list of projects that we looked at, but then we also included the full list of 100 projects. You know, so they are included and they are there if people want to look for additional opportunities, or if they're thinking about a project, wondering if we looked at that site already, those are there. And with this being a living document, I also don't want people to kind of get hung up on the time frame that we've identified for these, or saying that this is a high priority project and this is just on the other list, so it's probably not as good. You know, the idea is these are kind of what we saw as the low-hanging fruit, or the ones that would have the biggest impact. That doesn't mean that they're the only projects. It also doesn't mean that if we have a project listed in a long-term time frame and an opportunity comes up or funding comes on board, that we can start implementing them, that we shouldn't look at long-term projects just because all the short-term projects haven't been implemented yet. You know, there's moving targets here, and this is really just the initial framework, thinking about what we can do to improve water quality. And everything that we do as a watershed and as stakeholders in this watershed will have benefits within the watershed and within the rivers. And even if it's something as simple as having a conversation with neighbors or having a conversation with a classroom, you know, just that word of mouth and bringing awareness to the river is really an important aspect in this too. So there's a lot of rules and a lot of things that need to happen in tandem to really move these forward. And so the next question that we're bringing to people is, are there any projects that you're interested in spearheading? If you've looked at the plan, or if you're thinking about your community, something you would personally like to move forward, or if you've reviewed the plan, are there any additional project recommendations that you think we need? It's just kind of a starting point, thinking about moving into implementation. You know, it's a call to action. What do we want to do as individuals within the watershed? And so again, we're going to use the Mentimeter. So we can go back to this website or scan the QR code again. And that'll bring us back to the next slide in our Mentimeter, or the next two slides. Are there any projects that you're interested in spearheading or being involved, or types of projects that you would like to be involved with? I'm just going to give a shameless plug here because they're my favorite types of projects, but I really like a good stormwater project, especially when we can overlay with pollinator projects. it's a great opportunity to bring green into a street. And also to start kind of creating the conversation both around stormwater, which people often forget about when it stops raining. Or thinking about how we can reconnect our floodplains and use them to capture stormwater, but also kind of slow down the flow of the river. Or thinking about how we can use our yards or different vacant spaces. And a lot of the things that Rebecca already talked about. There's a lot of great ideas out there.
I'll add too, Nicole, and maybe encourage some people to share. My husband and I are avid gardeners, and one thing we're considering is installing rain gardens and making sure that we're putting the water that comes off of our roof to use and trying to actually soak that up on our property before it enters the stream near our house.
Thanks, Megan. I really appreciate that. And just to kind of point to how a project as simple as a small rain garden just in someone's yard can have big benefits. We installed 30 in across 2 neighborhoods in New Haven, and collectively they're capturing over 150,000 gallons of stormwater a year. So one small 60-foot garden can have a lot of impact, especially when your neighbors are building them too. And that's what we found with that project, was that we put in the first rain garden and someone came up and said, "What are you doing?" And they wanted one too. And it was really word of mouth by neighbors that made them cluster it as closely as they were. Or if there's any additional project sites or sites that you think would be really fantastic for reforestation, or thinking about how we should be working within the catch basins or addressing hotspots that you know of in your community or people that we should be talking to. It's not too late to start proposing ideas. Even though we're kind of at the end of this planning process, it's a living document. It's going to keep growing and new projects are going to be identified ongoing. Well, we'll keep this open for a little bit longer and see if there's anything that comes up. Conservation planning is exit 4B. That's a great one. And it sounds like talking to some people, stakeholders have been involved in this process. There have been some small projects like that at the exits. I shouldn't call them small. There were some big plantings that went in. And so continuing those is a great way to green. And that is something, the biofiltration of rain gardens on public lands. Rebecca alluded to this also, that we started looking at schools, but we did not nearly hit all of them. There are a lot of schools in this watershed. And one of the biggest obstacles, honestly, was just the amount of effort that's involved in coordinating school visits, because it's not as simple as showing up while we're doing field work and walking the property. There's a lot of sensitivity around working in school environments. And we tried to be very respectful of that while we were doing it. So there are opportunities there, and those are great opportunities to engage students and their parents and teachers as those projects go in, or even part of the assessment. So we'll jump back into the presentation. We are getting close, so I appreciate your time. There's a little bit more that we want to talk about tonight. And it's really, we're just moving into the next steps and then turning it back to you and hearing your thoughts and making this more of a conversation than just a presentation. So kind of the last component of this watershed plan, it's ongoing, it's part of implementation, and after implementation is monitoring. And part of the plan development was to identify gaps in data within the watershed. It wasn't just identifying what was going on in the watershed, but also thinking about where additional information would be helpful and what types of additional information would be helpful. And the one thing that we found was that there's really limited in-river water quality monitoring data. There's a stream gauge that's intermittently collected data over the years, but there's no long continuous data sets. And we have some big data sets for the harbor or within Eastchester Bay, but upriver, kind of north of the Bronx or north of the Mount Vernon Pelham area, there's really limited data available. So thinking about how we can figure out what's going on in the river, having a robust data set that would identify, what the system looks like now, it would help us to both know where problem areas are and kind of pinpoint them even more than we were able to do with land use models, but would also help us be able to show the benefits of the projects that we're doing. So that is one of the recommendations in the plan, is to identify a more robust water quality monitoring program. The other piece of that is that there was no total maximum daily load for the Hutchinson River, which made quantifiable load reductions for the projects and kind of targeting what we were looking for difficult to come by. What that is, a total maximum daily load, is really kind of a prescription to improve water quality. It's where you take a big data set and you model it and you say, this is the specific pounds per year of nitrogen that need to be removed to reduce this impairment, and that no more than this amount should be allowed to be added. And it's a combination of non-point sources and point sources, and thinking about the full river use to identify this. And it's a really handy tool when you're thinking about improving water quality. And so the fact that we didn't have those kind of load reduction set and we had limited water quality data available to us, we put together the best available model we could, but we really only looked at land use data. So having that in-stream component could go a long way, both for measuring progress and targeting additional areas that need to be addressed to really dig into what's causing the problems within this river. So we know what we do have is monitoring in Eastchester Bay. We also know a couple problem locations where bacteria is a big problem that are regularly monitored. And then we monitor as problem areas are identified. So if somebody reports a flowing sewer that during a dry day, people go out and test that and make sure that it's not raw sewage and try to trace it back and solve that problem. So having that monitoring component would definitely supplement the plan and be helpful, like, long term. And then that brings us to where we are in the planning process. So we've spent a lot of time really digging into the river, and Rebecca and her team have done a lot of work. There's been a lot of hours and a lot of data sifted through, a lot of feedback from the community that they've addressed and from the state. And so now we're turning it back to the public and asking people to read this plan and actually provide their comments and their feedback. So we will be accepting comments through February 16th, and then we're gonna kind of address the comments that we've received and put a bow on the Westchester portion county of the watershed. But that is not it for the Hutchinson River. And I think that's really important to think about today. Right now we've just been looking at the upper and mid watershed. But we do have funding to look at the Bronx, which is really the next phase. And because it is such a densely developed watershed, we decided to split it into 2 phases so that we had time to really look at what was happening within the Bronx and Westchester County, more that we had the field time to look at it and the time to think about this holistically. And so we are wrapping up Westchester County hopefully by the end of March. And we'll be moving into planning in the Bronx, hopefully towards the end of 2024, going through 2025. So just keep that in mind. We'll keep information on our website. We have the plan posted on our website, or our hard copy is available at the Westchester County offices. And if you reach out to Nicole Leibel ahead of time, or the information is on our website on how to view the physical copy, we can set up a time and make it easier for you. Comments can be emailed to either Katie or myself, or to reducerunoff@savethesound.com, which is honestly the best email address to use because it goes to both Katie and I. And we have somebody else who checks it too. So if we're not responding to emails that day, a couple people will see it and it won't get lost in the shuffle of emails. But also stay tuned, because just because we're wrapping up watershed planning in Westchester County doesn't mean that this is the end. We recognize that there may be a gap between what's happening here and what's happening in the Bronx, but that doesn't mean that work isn't happening. We're thinking about how to move this plan forward. We're still having conversations with partner groups, and we're also thinking about potentially holding an event in the watershed for World Water Day, which is on March 22nd. So keep your ears open. We'll keep it on our website and send it out to our email list. So if you didn't receive the information on the plan or for this meeting directly from Save the Sound, please put your email in the chat and we'll make sure that you're added to that list. And so you get information directly when it's set out. And thank you all for your time, because we do recognize that it is a weekday evening and evenings are difficult. So I'm going to take a moment and just recognize both Nicole Leibel, Rebecca, Kevin and Ellie Month from Biohabitats, and then Megan and Katie for all the work that they have done on this, as well as, again, the steering committee. Your time has been invaluable, so we really do appreciate all of it. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop talking. Does anybody have any questions or any final thoughts or anything they'd like to share with us? Well, this is fantastic. Thank you all for your time tonight. We'll hang around for a little bit if anyone has some last questions, but otherwise we will say good night. The plan will be available and we will make sure that the final draft of this plan is also posted, or the final version of this plan is also posted, so it's available as we start to move projects forward, or for anyone who's interested in reading it.
Is there any way you can ask a question?